The transport helicopter's rotors carved through the morning air like blades through silk, carrying with them the promise of what Command had called a routine peacekeeping deployment. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun pressed his face against the small window, watching the rugged landscape of the Kosovo mountains roll beneath them like a wrinkled map painted in shades of green and brown. The year was 2001, and the region still bore the invisible scars of conflict, though the official fighting had ended 2 years prior. Marcus adjusted his tactical vest and glanced around at his team. Corporal Sarah Williams sat across from him, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, her green eyes focused on the mission briefing folder in her hands. She had joined a unit 8 months ago, fresh from advanced combat training, but had already proven herself during their deployment in Bosnia. Next to her, Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez cleaned his rifle with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. At 19, Tommy was the youngest member of their squad, but his steady hands and quick thinking had earned him the respect of veterans twice his age. Sergeant Jake Morrison occupied the seat nearest the pilot's compartment, his weathered face betraying none of the thoughts that Marcus knew were running through his mind. Jake had served 3 tours in various hotspots around the world, and his ability to read situations had kept their team alive more times than anyone cared to count. There was something in Jake's posture this morning, though, a tension that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was just the usual pre-mission nerves, or maybe Jake sensed what Marcus was beginning to feel, that this assignment carried with it an undercurrent of something that didn't quite fit the official narrative. The mission parameters had seemed straightforward during the briefing back at base. Intelligence reports indicated increased activity in a remote mountain village called Vrekar, situated in a valley that had served as a smuggling corridor during the war. Local authorities suspected that weapons caches from the conflict were being moved through the area, possibly finding their way into the hands of extremist groups. The team's job was to establish a temporary observation post, monitor the situation for 72 hours, and report back with intelligence that could be used to coordinate a larger operation if necessary. What struck Marcus as odd was the lack of local support for the mission. Usually, peacekeeping operations included liaison officers from the local police or military, interpreters, and at least some coordination with regional commanders. This time, they were going alone, with orders to maintain radio silence, except for scheduled check-ins every 12 hours. The explanation given was that local authorities were concerned about information leaks, and that a small, discreet team would be more effective than a larger, more visible presence. The helicopter began its descent, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as they approached the landing zone. The pilot, a taciturn man named Stevens who had flown them into difficult situations before, turned back toward the passenger compartment and held up 5 fingers, indicating 5 minutes to touchdown. Marcus nodded and began the pre-insertion checklist that had become second nature after years of similar operations. Equipment check. Marcus ran his hands over his gear, feeling for the familiar weight and placement of everything he might need. M4 carbine secured, 3 extra magazines, sidearm, first aid kit, communications equipment, rations for 4 days, water purification tablets, night vision goggles, and the various small items that experienced soldiers learned to carry. Sarah was doing the same across from him, her movement efficient and professional. As the helicopter touched down in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, Marcus caught his first glimpse of the terrain they would be operating in. The valley was deeper than he had expected, with steep slopes rising on all sides. The vegetation was thick, providing excellent concealment, but also limiting visibility. A narrow dirt road wound through the valley floor, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. In the distance, perhaps 2 kilometers away, he could see the red tile roofs of Vrekar nestled against the base of the eastern ridge. The team disembarked quickly, moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had performed this dance many times before. As soon as they were clear of the landing zone, the helicopter lifted off, its noise fading rapidly as it disappeared over the northern ridge. Suddenly, The valley was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant bleating of goats somewhere up the mountainside. Marcus gathered his team around him and spread a map on a flat rock. The observation post they had selected from aerial photographs was located on a small prominence overlooking the village, approximately 800 meters from the nearest buildings. It would provide an excellent view of the main road and the surrounding area while offering good concealment and multiple escape routes if things went wrong. The hike to their position took 90 minutes through terrain that was more challenging than the maps had indicated. The forest was dense with undergrowth, and the team had to move carefully to avoid making noise or leaving obvious signs of their passage. Marcus found himself thinking about the last conversation he had had with his wife, Karen, before leaving for this deployment. She had sensed his uneasiness about the mission, though he hadn't been able to articulate exactly what bothered him about it. Karen Shin was not just a military wife. She was a former intelligence analyst who understood the nuances of military operations better than most spouses. Her concerns about this particular mission had been based on what she called the gaps in the briefing. Too many questions have been left unanswered, too many standard procedures have been waived, and too many of the usual safeguards have been eliminated. When Marcus had mentioned her concerns to his commanding officer, he had been told that the mission had been classified at a higher level than usual due to its sensitive nature, and that questions about operational security were above his pay grade. As they approached the observation post, Marcus called a halt and deployed his team in a security perimeter while he scouted the final approach. The position was everything the reconnaissance photos had promised: a natural depression in the rocky slope that provided protection from observation while offering clear lines of sight in multiple directions. A cluster of large boulders would serve as both concealment and cover, and the position was accessible from several different routes, making escape and evasion possible even if one or two approaches were compromised. Setting up the observation post took the remainder of the afternoon. Tommy and Sarah worked together to create camouflaged firing positions, using local vegetation and earth tone netting to break up the outlines of their equipment. Jake established the communications post, setting up the satellite radio, and testing the signal strength to confirm they could reach base when needed. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe both the village below and the surrounding terrain, using high-power binoculars to study the area in detail. The village of Raykar appeared peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Marcus could see people moving about their daily business in the narrow streets. Children played in a small square near what appeared to be the village school, and an elderly man led a small flock of sheep along the main road. Nothing about the scene suggested the kind of illegal activity that had prompted their mission, but Marcus knew that appearances could be deceiving. As evening approached, the team settled into their observation routine. They would maintain a 24-hour watch, with 2 people on duty at all times while the other 2 rested. Marcus took the first watch with Sarah, positioning themselves where they could observe different sectors while remaining in communication with each other. The sun set behind the western ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red before fading to purple and, finally, black. As darkness settled over the valley, lights began to appear in the village below. Marcus switched to night vision equipment and continued his surveillance, noting the patterns of activity and the movement of vehicles along the road. It was during this first night that Marcus began to notice things that didn't quite fit the intelligence reports they had been given. The traffic along the road was lighter than expected, consisting mainly of local farmers and villagers going about their normal business. There were no signs of the heavy vehicles that would be needed to transport weapons caches, no unusual gatherings of people, and no indication of the kind of organized activity that typically accompanied arms smuggling operations. More troubling was what Marcus observed on the surrounding ridges. Several times during the night, he caught glimpses of movement in positions that would be perfect for surveillance or ambush. When he used his night vision equipment to investigate, he found nothing, but his instincts told him that his team was being watched. Jake confirmed this suspicion when he reported similar observations from his position covering the northern approach to their post. By dawn of their first full day in position, Marcus had reached a disturbing conclusion. Either the intelligence reports that had led to their mission were completely wrong, or they had been sent to this valley for reasons that had nothing to do with the official mission parameters. The village below showed no signs of illegal activity, but the team's observation post was clearly of interest to someone who had the skills and equipment to conduct counter-surveillance operations. During the day, Marcus observed the village through high-powered optics, creating detailed sketches of the layout and noting the patterns of daily life. The villagers appeared to be engaged in normal agricultural activities, tending gardens, caring for livestock, and maintaining their homes. A few vehicles traveled the road during daylight hours, but they were typical civilian trucks and automobiles, not the kind of transport that would raise suspicions. What concerned Marcus more was the gradual realization that his team's position was being bracketed by observers on the surrounding ridges. Throughout the day, he caught fleeting glimpses of reflected light that suggested optical equipment, brief movements that indicated human activity, and other subtle signs that trained operatives were studying his team's location. When he mentioned these observations during the evening communication check with base, he was told that local military units were conducting training exercises in the region, and that the movement he was detecting was probably related to those activities. The explanation might have been plausible if Marcus hadn't noticed that the observation activity was clearly focused on his team's position rather than being part of a general training exercise. Professional soldiers conducting legitimate training would not need to maintain such detailed surveillance of a peacekeeping unit that was operating with full authorization from higher command. The attention his team was receiving suggested either that they were suspected of hostile intent or that they were being set up for something that would require precise knowledge of their location and capabilities. As the second day progressed, Marcus found himself facing a dilemma that went to the heart of military service. He was trained to follow orders and trust the judgment of his superiors, but his experience and instincts were telling him that his team had been placed in a situation that was far more dangerous than the official mission briefing had indicated. The question was whether to continue following orders and hope that his suspicions were unfounded, or to take action based on his assessment of the threat and risk being accused of disobeying lawful orders. The decision was made for him late on the second evening, when Jake intercepted radio communications that were not supposed to exist. Using equipment that was more sophisticated than what was typically issued for peacekeeping missions, Jake had been monitoring multiple frequencies as part of his communication security responsibilities. What he discovered was a series of coded transmissions between units that were using military-grade encryption and tactical call signs that didn't match any of the training exercises that Base had mentioned. More alarming was the content of the transmissions, which Jake was able to partially decode using software that he had acquired during previous intelligence assignments. The communications indicated that multiple units were being positioned around the valley, that they had detailed information about Marcus's team's location and capabilities, and that some kind of operation was planned for the following morning. The references to target elimination and evidence disposal left little doubt about the true nature of what was being planned. Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his military career as he studied the intelligence that Jake had gathered. Every instinct told him that his team had been betrayed, that they had been sent into the valley not to observe illegal activities, but to become victims of those activities. Someone within the command structure had provided their enemies with detailed information about their mission, their location, and their capabilities. The peaceful village below was probably exactly what it appeared to be, while the real threat came from the people who were supposed to be protecting them. The options available to Marcus were all bad. If he followed orders and remained in position, his team would almost certainly be killed or captured when the operation began in the morning. If he evacuated the position and tried to reach the extraction point, they would be moving through terrain that was certainly under surveillance and probably already occupied by hostile forces. If he called for assistance, he would be using communication channels that had possibly been compromised, and help might not arrive in time even if his superiors believe his assessment of the situation. As Marcus weighed these options, he realized that the mission had been designed to fail from the beginning. The lack of local support, the isolation from normal command structures, the unusual communication protocols, and the suspicious intelligence reports all pointed to a deliberate plan to place his team in an untenable situation. The question was whether the betrayal came from within his own command structure, from local authorities who had been compromised, or from some combination of both. The third day dawned gray and cold, with low clouds hanging in the valley like a shroud. Marcus had made his decision during the long hours of darkness, weighing the risks and responsibilities of command against the safety of his soldiers. He would not allow his team to remain in a position where they were sitting targets for an operation that appeared designed to eliminate them. Whatever the consequences for his career, he was going to get his people out of the valley before the trap could be sprung. As he prepared to brief his team on their new mission, Marcus caught sight of movement on the forsaken ridge that dominated the eastern side of the valley. Someone was positioning themselves in what any experienced soldier would recognize as a sniper's hide, a carefully concealed position that offered a clear field of fire toward the observation post. The shot that would change everything was only hours away, and Marcus Chun was about to discover that sometimes survival requires choosing between loyalty and life. The morning of the third day brought with it a tension that Marcus could feel in his bones. He had seen Jake's evidence, studied the intercepted communications, and spent the dark hours before dawn wrestling with a decision that would either save his team's lives or end his military career. As the first pale light filtered through the low-hanging clouds, Marcus gathered his soldiers around him in the sheltered depression that had served as their home for the past 72 hours. Sarah Williams looked tired but alert, her weapon cleaned and ready, her gear packed with the efficiency that came from years of training. Tommy Rodriguez checked his equipment with nervous energy, his young face betraying the anxiety that he was trying hard to conceal. Jake Morrison sat quietly, his weathered features giving no hint of the intelligence he had gathered during the night, but his eyes held the same wariness that Marcus felt in his own chest. Marcus spread the map between them and began to explain what he had decided, knowing that his words would irrevocably change the nature of their mission and possibly their futures. The official orders called for them to remain in position until the scheduled extraction the following day, but the intelligence Jake had intercepted suggested that they would not survive that long if they continued to follow those orders. The radio intercepts had revealed the presence of at least 3 separate units positioned around the valley, using military-grade equipment and tactical procedures that were far too sophisticated for the local militia groups that were supposed to be the target of their surveillance mission. More troubling was the fact that these units possessed detailed information about Marcus's team, including their exact location, their communication schedule, and their planned extraction point. This level of intelligence could only have come from within their own command structure. As Marcus outlined his assessment of the situation, he watched his team's faces for signs of doubt or disagreement. Sarah's expression grew more serious as she grasped the implications of what he was telling them, but she didn't interrupt or question his judgment. Tommy's eyes widened as he began to understand that they might have been sent into a trap, but his training kept him focused on the tactical situation rather than the political implications. Jake nodded grimly as Marcus described the intercepted communications, confirming details that only made the picture more disturbing. The plan Marcus proposed was risky, but offered their best chance of survival. Instead of waiting for the scheduled extraction, they would move immediately to an alternate extraction point that he would negotiate with base command. They would travel through terrain that was difficult but offered better concealment than the valley floor, avoiding the most obvious routes that their enemies would expect them to use. Most importantly, they would maintain communication silence except for emergency situations, preventing their location from being tracked through radio intercepts. What Marcus didn't tell his team was that he suspected their own command structure had been compromised, and that calling for extraction might only serve to reveal their new position to the people who were hunting them. The alternate extraction point he had in mind was one that he and Jake had scouted during a previous mission, a location that was not included in any of their official operational plans. If his suspicions were correct, it might be the only place where they could safely rendezvous with friendly forces. As they prepared to move out, Marcus took one last look at the village below through his binoculars. The peaceful scene of daily life, continuing unchanged, seemed to mock the danger that surrounded his team. Children walked to school along the narrow streets. Shopkeepers opened their stores, and farmers prepared for another day of work in their fields. Whatever conspiracy had drawn his team to this valley, the villagers below appeared to be innocent of any involvement in it. The movement up the ridge behind their observation post was more difficult than Marcus had anticipated. The terrain was steep and rocky, covered with loose stone that shifted underfoot and threatened to send them tumbling back down the slope. They had to move carefully to avoid dislodging rocks that might alert observers to their passage, while also maintaining the speed necessary to reach concealment before the sun rose high enough to eliminate the shadows that hid their movement. Sarah took point, using her skills as a reconnaissance specialist to find the best route through the treacherous terrain. Her auburn hair was hidden beneath her helmet, and her movement was so smooth and quiet that Marcus sometimes lost sight of her even though she was only 20 meters ahead. Tommy followed behind her, carrying the team's heavier equipment with the determined endurance that had made him such a valuable member of the squad despite his youth. Jake brought up the rear, periodically stopping to observe their back trail and ensure that they were not being followed. His position also allowed him to monitor radio frequencies for any indication that their movement had been detected. The mountain was eerily quiet except for the sound of wind through the sparse vegetation and the occasional cry of a bird wheeling overhead. It was Jake who first detected the signs that their departure from the observation post had not gone unnoticed. As they paused for rest in a grove of stunted trees about halfway up the ridge, he caught fragments of radio transmissions that indicated search teams were being dispatched to their former location. The timing of these transmissions confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the level of surveillance they had been under, and suggested that their enemies had expected them to remain in position until they could be eliminated or captured. What worried Marcus more was the professional nature of the response to their movement. Instead of the confused and delayed reaction that might be expected from local militia groups, the search teams were being coordinated with military precision. Units were being repositioned to block potential escape routes. Observation posts were being established on commanding terrain, and communication protocols were being implemented that would allow the hunters to coordinate their movements without revealing their positions to their prey. As they continued their climb toward the ridge line, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The mission briefing that had seemed slightly odd, the lack of local support that had been explained away as operational security, the communication protocols that isolated them from normal command channels, and the intelligence reports that had proven to be completely inaccurate. Each element by itself might have been explained by the normal friction and confusion that accompanied military operations, but taken together, they painted a picture of deliberate deception. The question that haunted Marcus was the identity of the person or persons within his own command structure who had betrayed his team. It had to be someone with access to detailed operational information, someone who could influence mission planning and communication procedures, and someone who had the authority to override normal safety protocols. The list of people who met those criteria was short, but it included individuals that Marcus had trusted with his life on previous occasions. As they reached the ridge line, the full scope of their predicament became clear. From their elevated position, Marcus could see movement on multiple ridges around the valley, confirming the presence of the coordinated search teams that Jake's radio intercepts had revealed. More disturbing was the sight of uniformed figures moving through the forest below them, following tracks that led directly from their abandoned observation post toward their current position. The hunters were using tracking skills and technology that were far beyond the capabilities of local militia groups. Marcus could see the distinctive signatures of military-grade thermal imaging equipment being used to scan the terrain and The search pattern being employed was one that he recognized from his own training in pursuit operations. These were professional soldiers, not irregulars, and they had the resources and expertise to make escape extremely difficult. Sarah had found a concealed position among the rocks near the ridge line where they could observe the valley while remaining hidden from the search teams below. As Marcus joined her behind a large boulder, she handed him the binoculars and pointed toward the eastern ridge where he had observed suspicious movement the day before. What Marcus saw through the powerful optics made his blood run cold. A sniper's hide had been constructed in a natural depression among the rocks, carefully camouflaged but visible to someone who knew what to look for. The position offered a perfect view of their former observation post and the most likely routes that a team might use to escape from that position. If they had followed their original plan and remained in the valley until the scheduled extraction, they would have been sitting targets for whoever occupied that hide. Even more chilling was the realization that the sniper's position had been prepared well in advance of their arrival. The camouflage materials were weathered in a way that indicated they had been in place for several days, and the construction of the hide showed the kind of careful planning that suggested detailed knowledge of their mission parameters. Someone had known exactly where his team would be positioned, and had prepared to eliminate them with precision and efficiency. As Marcus studied the sniper's hide through the binoculars, a figure moved briefly into view before disappearing again behind the concealment. The glimpse was too brief to identify the individual, but it was enough to confirm that the position was occupied and that the threat was immediate and real. Marcus passed the binoculars to Jake and watched as his expression grew increasingly grim. Jake's assessment confirmed Marcus's fears. The sniper's position was professionally constructed and perfectly positioned, the kind of hide that could only be built by someone with extensive military training. More troubling was Jake's observation that the position appeared to be equipped with communications equipment that would allow the sniper to coordinate with the search teams that were now moving through the forest below them. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that Marcus wished he couldn't see. His team had been sent into the valley not to conduct surveillance, but to be eliminated. The mission parameters had been designed to place them in a specific location at a specific time, where they could be killed by a sniper who had been positioned and equipped well in advance. The official story about arms smuggling and local militia groups was fiction, designed to provide plausible cover for what was actually an assassination operation. But why? What had his team done, or what did they know, that made them targets for elimination? Marcus searched his memory for anything that might explain why someone would want them dead, but found nothing that seemed significant enough to justify such an elaborate conspiracy. They were competent soldiers, but they were not special operations personnel with access to highly classified information. They had served in various peacekeeping operations, but nothing they had seen or done seemed to warrant the level of attention they were receiving. The answer came to Marcus as he watched the coordinated movement of the search teams below. It wasn't what they knew that made them dangerous. It was what they might discover if they remain alive. Someone within the command structure was involved in activities that would not bear scrutiny, and Marcus's team had been selected for elimination not because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. Honest soldiers who might ask inconvenient questions or report uncomfortable truths. The thought that his own commanders might be involved in criminal activities was almost too disturbing to contemplate, but it was the only explanation that fit the facts. The mission to Kosovo had been a cover for something else, something that required the elimination of witnesses who might compromise the operation. His team had been selected because they were competent enough to be believable as participants in a legitimate mission, but isolated enough to be eliminated without raising too many questions. As these realizations settled over Marcus like a cold fog, he began to understand that their situation was far worse than he had initially assessed. They were not just being hunted by enemy forces. They were being hunted by people who had access to all the resources of their own military organization. Every safe house, every extraction point, every communication channel that they might normally rely upon could be compromised. They were truly alone, with nowhere to run and no one to trust. The sound of helicopters in the distance confirmed Marcus's assessment of their predicament. The search was being expanded beyond what local forces could mount, involving aircraft and personnel that could only be provided by higher military authorities. As the sound grew louder, Marcus realized that they had minutes, not hours, before their position would be overrun by forces that had every advantage except the knowledge that their prey was aware of being hunted. The decision to move came without conscious thought. Marcus signaled to his team to prepare for immediate departure, and they began the dangerous process of moving along the ridgeline while remaining concealed from the aircraft that were beginning to circle the valley. The terrain offered some protection, but they would have to move quickly and carefully to avoid being spotted from the air. As they prepared to leave their temporary refuge, Marcus took one last look at the sniper's hide on the eastern ridge. The figure was visible again, and this time Marcus was able to make out enough detail to confirm his worst fears. The sniper was wearing a uniform that Marcus recognized, carrying equipment that was standard issue for their own forces, and moving with the confidence of someone who knew that the operation had the full backing of legitimate authority. The shot from the Forsaken Ridge had not yet been fired, but Marcus knew that it was only a matter of time. Someone had invested considerable resources in setting up this elaborate trap, and they would not give up easily when they discovered that their prey had escaped the initial snare. The hunt would continue, and Marcus and his team would have to use every skill they had learned in years of military service just to survive the next 24 hours. As they began their desperate flight along the ridge line, Marcus found himself thinking about Karen and the conversation they had had before this deployment. Her instincts about the mission had been correct, and her warnings about the unusual aspects of their orders had proven to be more accurate than either of them had realized. If he survived this ordeal, he would have some difficult questions to ask about the people who had sent him and his team into this valley to die. But survival was far from certain. The helicopters were getting closer, the search teams were moving up the slopes toward their position, and somewhere on the Forsaken Ridge, a sniper was waiting for the perfect shot that would end their flight and complete the mission that had brought them to this remote valley in the mountains of Kosovo. The helicopter's rotors beat against the mountain air like the wings of some mechanical predator, growing louder with each passing second as it approached their position on the ridgeline. Marcus Chun pressed himself against the cold rock and motioned for his team to freeze in whatever concealment they could find. Through a gap in the stones, he could see the aircraft banking toward them, its thermal imaging equipment sweeping the terrain in methodical patterns that left nowhere to hide. Sarah Williams had wedged herself beneath an overhang of granite, her rifle held ready, but useless against the armored aircraft above. Tommy Rodriguez lay flat against the slope, using sparse vegetation and shadow to break up his outline, while Jake Morrison had found a depression between two large boulders that offered protection from observation, but would become a death trap if ground forces approached from below. The helicopter passed directly overhead, so close that Marcus could see the faces of the crew through the aircraft's windows. They were wearing uniforms he recognized, flying equipment that belonged to his own military organization, and conducting what appeared to be a legitimate search and rescue operation. To any observer, they would look like dedicated soldiers trying to locate a missing team of peacekeepers. Only Marcus and his men knew that the people in the aircraft above them were actually hunting them with orders to kill. As the helicopter moved past their position and began searching the valley below, Marcus signaled for his team to continue their movement along the ridge. They had perhaps minutes before the aircraft completed its search pattern and returned to their sector, and they needed to use that time to reach terrain that would offer better concealment from aerial observation. The ridge line they were following was narrow and treacherous, with steep drops on both sides and loose rock that shifted underfoot with every step. The morning sun had burned away the protective clouds, leaving them exposed against the light-colored stone of the mountainside. Moving during daylight was dangerous, but Remaining in place while search teams closed in from multiple directions would be suicide. Jake had been monitoring radio communications as they moved, using a small receiver that could intercept military frequencies without transmitting anything that might reveal their location. The intelligence he gathered painted a picture of a massive operation involving dozens of personnel and sophisticated equipment. Search teams were moving up from the valley floor, blocking positions were being established at key terrain features, and aerial surveillance was being coordinated with ground forces in a way that would make escape almost impossible. What troubled Marcus most was the professional quality of the operation being conducted against them. This was not the hasty pursuit that might be expected from local forces reacting to an unexpected situation. Every aspect of the search showed careful planning and detailed knowledge of the terrain, the target, and the most effective methods for hunting trained soldiers in mountain environment. Someone had anticipated their escape from the observation post and had prepared contingencies that took into account every possible route they might use. As they moved along a narrow ledge that skirted the northern face of the ridge, Sarah spotted movement in the valley below that confirmed Marcus's worst fears. A line of soldiers was advancing up the slope in a formation that he recognized from his own training in pursuit operations. They were using proper intervals and communication procedures, moving with the disciplined coordination that could only come from extensive training and experience. These were not militia fighters or local security forces. They were professional military personnel conducting a textbook search and destroy mission. The realization that they were being hunted by their own people was almost too disturbing to process, but the evidence was undeniable. The uniforms, equipment, and tactics being employed against them were identical to those that Marcus and his team used in their own operations. Someone within the military command structure had organized this operation using official resources and personnel, which meant that the conspiracy against them reached into the highest levels of authority. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to spot the sniper's muzzle flash on the Forsaken Ridge across the valley. The brief flicker of light was barely visible in the bright morning sun, but Tommy's young eyes caught the reflection and he immediately alerted the rest of the team to the danger. Marcus turned his binoculars toward the eastern ridge and located the sniper's position, confirming that the hide they had observed the day before was indeed occupied and active. The sniper was not targeting them directly. Instead, the rifle was being used to eliminate potential witnesses in the village below. Through his binoculars, Marcus watched in horror as a farmer who had been working in his fields suddenly collapsed, struck down by a bullet fired from over a kilometer away. The precision of the shot was remarkable, but its purpose was even more chilling. The sniper was systematically eliminating anyone in the village who might be able to testify about the presence of military forces in the area. As Marcus continued to observe the village through his optics, he saw more evidence of the true scope of the operation being conducted against them. Military vehicles that had been concealed during their surveillance mission were now moving openly through the streets of Raykar. Soldiers were going from house to house, conducting what appeared to be a search operation, but was actually something far more sinister. The villagers who emerged from their homes were being loaded into trucks and driven away, while those who resisted or tried to flee were being shot without warning. Marcus realized that he was witnessing the systematic elimination of an entire community, carried out by people wearing the uniform of his own country. The peaceful village that had seemed so innocent during their surveillance was being destroyed to eliminate any evidence of what had really happened in this remote valley. The horror of what he was witnessing was almost overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to focus on the immediate tactical situation. The genocide being conducted in the village below confirmed that the people hunting his team would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from emerging. They had already demonstrated their willingness to murder innocent civilians. Eliminating 4 soldiers would be a minor addition to their crimes. Jake's voice broke through Marcus's concentration as he reported new radio intercepts that indicated their position had been compromised. Search teams were being redirected toward their section of the ridge, and helicopter gunships were being called in to provide fire support. The loose cordon that had been established around the valley was tightening into a noose that would soon make escape impossible. The decision to continue moving came without discussion. Staying ahead of the search teams was their only chance of survival, even though every step they took across the exposed ridge line increased the risk of being spotted from the air or from observation posts on surrounding peaks. The alternative was to remain in place and be systematically hunted down by forces that had every advantage in equipment, numbers, and knowledge of the terrain. As they resumed their desperate flight, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of command that had led to this moment. Someone at a very high level had authorized the use of military resources for what was clearly a criminal operation. The planning and coordination required for this mission would have involved multiple agencies and dozens of personnel, all of whom had to be either complicit in the crimes being committed or completely unaware of the true nature of their activities. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoing across the valley indicated that the search teams had found something, though Marcus couldn't tell whether they had discovered evidence of his team's passage or were simply eliminating more witnesses. The professional efficiency with which the operation was being conducted suggested that this was not the first time these particular units had been used for such purposes. Sarah called a halt as they approached a section of the ridge where the narrow ledge they had been following disappeared into a sheer rock face. The only way forward required a dangerous climb across exposed granite that would leave them visible from multiple directions for several minutes. Behind them, the sound of helicopters was growing louder as the search pattern brought the aircraft closer to their position. Marcus studied the terrain ahead through his binoculars, looking for any alternative to the exposed climb that would take them across the rock face. The ridge continued on the other side of the obstacle, offering concealment and multiple escape routes, but reaching it would require moving through a zone where they would be completely vulnerable to observation and fire from ground forces and aircraft. The decision was made for them when Jake reported radio intercepts indicating that their last known position had been triangulated through electronic surveillance. The search teams now had a precise location to focus their efforts, and helicopter gunships were being directed to establish a cordon around the area. Within minutes, their current position would be untenable regardless of the risks involved in moving across the exposed rock face. Tommy Rodriguez volunteered to go first, using his youth and agility to find the best route across the treacherous terrain. Marcus watched through his binoculars as the young soldier began the dangerous traverse, moving with careful precision from handhold to handhold across the granite face. Every second that Tommy remained exposed on the rock wall increased the chance that he would be spotted by the search teams that were converging on their position. The shot that Marcus had been dreading came just as Tommy reached the midpoint of his climb. The crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the distinctive whine of a bullet striking rock just inches from Tommy's position. The sniper on the Forsaken Ridge had finally found a target, and only the difficulty of the shot at extreme range had prevented a direct hit. Tommy pressed himself against the rock face as more shots rang out, each one coming closer as the sniper adjusted for range and wind. Sarah and Jake opened fire on the sniper's position with their assault rifles, hoping to disrupt his aim, even though the range was far beyond the effective capabilities of their weapons. Marcus used his radio to call for immediate suppressing fire, forgetting for a moment that the people who might respond to such a call were probably the same ones who had ordered his team's elimination. The suppressing fire came from an unexpected source as villagers who had escaped the massacre in Vrekar began shooting at the military forces from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. Marcus realized that some of the local population had managed to arm themselves and were now fighting back against the soldiers who had destroyed their community. The additional gunfire created confusion among the search teams and forced the helicopters to alter their flight patterns to avoid ground fire. Using the distraction created by the villagers' resistance, Tommy completed his climb across the exposed rock face and disappeared into concealment on the far side of the obstacle. Sarah followed next, moving with the smooth efficiency that had made her one of the best reconnaissance specialists in their unit. She reached the other side without drawing fire, though the sound of bullets striking the rock behind her indicated that the sniper was still active and dangerous. Jake's crossing was more difficult because he was carrying the team's communications equipment and extra ammunition. The additional weight slowed his movement and forced him to take more risks with his handholds and footing. Marcus covered his advance with accurate rifle fire directed toward the sniper's position, though he knew that his shots were unlikely to be effective at such extreme range. When Marcus began his own traverse of the rock face, he could hear the helicopters approaching from multiple directions and knew that he had only seconds before the aircraft would be in position to engage him with their weapons. The granite was cold beneath his hands, and the exposure to the long drop below was terrifying, but the immediate threat of being shot by his own people was far more urgent than his fear of falling. The bullet that finally found its mark caught Marcus in the left shoulder just as he reached the safety of the concealment on the far side of the rock face. The impact spun him around and nearly caused him to lose his grip, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving until he collapsed behind a large boulder where his team was waiting. The wound was painful, but not immediately life-threatening, though it would limit his mobility and effectiveness in the battles to come. Sarah immediately began treating Marcus's wound, while Jake established a defensive perimeter and Tommy monitored their back trail for signs of pursuit. The shoulder wound was a through hit that had missed the major blood vessels and bones, but it would require medical attention soon to prevent infection and excessive blood loss. As Sarah worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize the wound, Marcus studied the terrain ahead and tried to formulate a plan for their continued escape. They had gained some distance from their immediate pursuers, but the helicopters overhead could track their movement and direct ground forces to intercept them at any point along their route. The wounded shoulder would slow him down and make him a liability to the team's chances of survival. The sound of explosions from the direction of the village indicated that the military forces were using heavy weapons to complete the destruction of Raykar and eliminate any remaining witnesses. Marcus realized that the systematic murder of an entire community was being carried out with the same professional efficiency that characterized the hunt for his team. Whatever conspiracy had led to this moment involved people who were willing to commit genocide to protect their secrets. Jake reported new radio intercepts indicating that additional units were being called in to expand the search area and establish blocking positions at key terrain features. The operation was growing beyond what local commanders could authorize or control, which suggested that orders were coming from very high levels of authority. Marcus and his team were not just fighting for their lives against a few rogue soldiers. They were being hunted by a significant portion of their own military organization. The shot from a forsaken ridge had found its mark, but it had not achieved its intended purpose of eliminating the target. Marcus was wounded, but alive. His team was still functional, and they had gained valuable intelligence about the scope and nature of the conspiracy against them. The hunt would continue, but now the hunters knew that their prey was aware of being stalked and would not be taken easily. As they prepared to continue their flight across the mountainous terrain, Marcus realized that survival was only the first part of their mission. If they managed to escape the immediate pursuit, they would face the even more difficult task of exposing the crimes they had witnessed and identifying the people responsible for ordering the massacre at Raykar. The shot that had wounded him was just the beginning of a battle that would determine not only their survival, but the fate of everyone who had died in the peaceful village below. The field dressing Sarah Williams had applied to Marcus Chin's shoulder wound was already showing spots of red as they moved through the dense forest on the northern slope of the ridge. The bullet had torn through muscle and tissue, creating a painful injury that would require proper medical attention soon. But Marcus forced himself to ignore the throbbing pain and concentrate on keeping his team alive. Behind them, the sound of helicopters grew more distant, but the radio intercepts that Jake Morrison continued to monitor indicated that their pursuers were reorganizing for a more systematic search of the surrounding terrain. Tommy Rodriguez had taken point, using his youth and energy to scout the safest route through the thick undergrowth that covered this section of the mountain. The forest provided excellent concealment from aerial observation, but it also limited visibility and made it difficult to detect ground forces that might be moving to intercept them. Every rustling branch could conceal an enemy soldier, and every shadow might hide a sniper's rifle. As they descended into a narrow ravine that cut through the mountainside, Marcus began to formulate a plan that went beyond simple escape and evasion. The massacre at Vraykar had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against them, and he realized that running away would only delay the inevitable. The people hunting them had demonstrated their willingness to commit genocide to protect their secrets, and they would never stop pursuing the witnesses who could expose their crimes. The only way to survive in the long term was to gather evidence of what had happened and find a way to present that evidence to authorities who were not part of the conspiracy. This would require taking enormous risks and operating without any support from their normal command structure. But Marcus could see no alternative that would allow him and his team to live with any hope of justice being served. Jake's latest radio intercepts provided both good news and bad news about their tactical situation. The good news was that the helicopters had lost their trail and were now searching in the wrong area, giving them a temporary reprieve from aerial surveillance. The bad news was that roadblocks had been established at every possible exit point from the mountain region, and additional units were being brought in to conduct a house-to-house search of every village within a 50-kilometer radius. The systematic nature of the search operation confirmed Marcus's assessment that they were dealing with a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and political authority. The resources being committed to their elimination were far beyond what any local commander could authorize, and the coordination between different units suggested a level of planning that could only come from senior leadership. Sarah had been studying a detailed map of the region while they rested in the concealment of the ravine, and she had identified several locations where they might be able to gather evidence of the crimes being committed against the civilian population. The village of Vraykar was certainly lost, but there were other communities in the area that might become targets as the conspiracy worked to eliminate all witnesses to their activities. The decision to change from hunted to hunter was not made lightly, but Marcus realized that it was their only chance for long-term survival. Instead of continuing to flee through terrain that was increasingly dominated by their enemies, they would use their military training to gather intelligence and strike back against the forces that had betrayed them. The transformation from peacekeepers to guerrilla fighters was a fundamental change in their mission, but it was one that circumstances had forced upon them. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to spot signs of the enemy's presence in their new operational area. As they moved through the forest toward a small village that intelligence reports had identified as a potential target, Tommy detected the distinctive signatures of a military encampment hidden among the trees. The professional camouflage and security procedures being employed confirmed that these were the same forces that had destroyed Vraykar and were now hunting Marcus's team. From a concealed observation position, Marcus studied the enemy camp through his binoculars and began to understand the full scope of the operation being conducted against the civilian population. The camp contained enough personnel and equipment to conduct operations against multiple targets simultaneously, and the communications equipment he could see indicated coordination with higher headquarters and other units in the field. Most disturbing was the presence of mass grave-digging equipment and body disposal supplies that suggested the systematic murder of civilians was a planned and ongoing operation rather than an isolated incident. Marcus realized that the massacre at Vraykar was just one part of a larger genocidal campaign that was being carried out under the cover of legitimate military operations. Jake's electronic surveillance of the camp's communications revealed details that made the situation even more horrifying. The orders being transmitted to and from the camp included target lists of villages to be pacified, schedules for elimination operations, and coordination instructions for the disposal of evidence. The professional terminology used in these communications was chilling in its bureaucratic efficiency, reducing mass murder to routine administrative procedures. The intelligence gathered from their surveillance of the enemy camp provided Marcus with the evidence he needed to prove the existence of the conspiracy, but it also revealed the massive scale of the crimes being committed. Hundreds or possibly thousands of innocent people were being systematically murdered by forces operating under official authority, and the operation appeared to have been planned and approved at the highest levels of government. Sarah Williams had been using her reconnaissance skills to identify potential targets within the enemy camp that could be attacked with their limited resources. The communication center was heavily guarded, but represented a high-value target that could disrupt coordination between the various units participating in the genocidal campaign. The equipment storage area contained ammunition and fuel that could be destroyed to hamper ongoing operations. Most importantly, the command post contained personnel who might possess detailed knowledge of the conspiracy and could be captured for interrogation. The plan Marcus developed required splitting his already small team and taking enormous risks against a numerically superior enemy, but he could see no alternative that would allow them to survive while also exposing the crimes being committed against innocent civilians. They would conduct a simultaneous attack on multiple targets within the camp, gather as much intelligence as possible, and escape before reinforcements could respond to their assault. Tommy Rodriguez volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission, which involved infiltrating the communication center and stealing or destroying the equipment that the enemy was using to coordinate their operations. His youth and small size would allow him to move through the camp's defensive perimeter with less chance of detection, but he would be completely on his own if things went wrong. Jake Morrison would attack the equipment storage area, using explosive devices improvised from materials they had captured during their surveillance of the camp. His extensive experience with demolitions made him the logical choice for this target, and the destruction of fuel and ammunition would significantly impact the enemy's ability to continue their operations against civilian targets. Sarah Williams would provide sniper support for the operation, using her marksmanship skills to eliminate sentries and provide covering fire for Tommy and Jake as they conducted their attacks on their assigned targets. Her position on high ground overlooking the camp would also allow her to observe the enemy's response to the attack and provide early warning of reinforcements approaching the area. Marcus would lead the assault on the command post, hoping to capture personnel who could provide information about the conspiracy and gather documents that would prove the existence of the genocidal campaign. His wounded shoulder would limit his mobility and effectiveness, but his leadership and tactical experience were essential for the success of this critical part of the mission. The attack began just before dawn, when the enemy guards were at their least alert, and the darkness provided maximum concealment for the infiltrating team members. Tommy Rodriguez moved through the perimeter like a ghost, using skills learned in years of military training to avoid the sensors and guards that protected the communication center. His approach was so quiet and skillful that the first indication of his presence was the explosion that destroyed the primary radio equipment and plunged the camp into confusion. Jake Morrison's assault on the equipment storage area came seconds later, as carefully placed charges detonated among fuel drums and ammunition stockpiles. The resulting explosions lit up the pre-dawn darkness and sent secondary blasts rippling through the camp as stored ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. The destruction was far more extensive than Jake had anticipated, and the fires that resulted would burn for hours. Sarah Williams opened fire from her overwatch position as soon as the explosions began, systematically eliminating enemy personnel who were trying to organize a response to the attack. Her accurate rifle fire kept the defenders pinned down and prevented them from mounting an effective counterattack against Tommy and Jake as they withdrew from their target areas. Marcus's assault on the command post met fierce resistance from guards who had been alerted by the explosions, but the confusion caused by the other attacks allowed him to reach his objective before the defenders could organize an effective defense. The hand-to-hand fighting was brutal and intense, complicated by his wounded shoulder, but his determination to gather evidence of the conspiracy gave him the strength to overcome the enemy personnel protecting the command post. The intelligence Marcus gathered from the command post exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Detailed operational plans, personnel rosters, communication logs, and financial records provided overwhelming evidence of a systematic campaign of genocide that had been planned and approved at the highest levels of government. The documents revealed that the massacre at Vrekar was just one of dozens of similar operations that had been conducted over a period of months. Most shocking was the discovery that the conspiracy included not only military personnel, but also civilian officials, intelligence operatives, and international representatives who were supposed to be monitoring compliance with peace agreements. The scale of corruption and criminality was almost impossible to comprehend, involving hundreds of people in positions of authority and responsibility. As Marcus and his team withdrew from the devastated enemy camp, they carried with them evidence that would expose one of the largest war crimes operations in recent history. The documents and recordings they had captured proved beyond any doubt that genocide was being conducted under official authority, and identified many of the individuals responsible for planning and executing the mass murders. But possessing the evidence was only the first step in exposing the conspiracy. Marcus realized that presenting the information to authorities within their normal command structure would likely result in the evidence being suppressed and his team being eliminated. They needed to find someone outside the conspiracy who had the authority and integrity to act on the information they had gathered. The sound of helicopters in the distance indicated that reinforcements were responding to their attack on the camp, and Marcus knew that their brief advantage would soon disappear as superior numbers and equipment were brought to bear against them. The successful strike had gathered valuable intelligence, but it had also revealed their location to the enemy and would provoke an even more intensive search operation. As they moved through the forest toward their next hiding place, Marcus found himself thinking about the magnitude of the crimes they had uncovered and the responsibility they now bore as the only witnesses who possessed proof of what was happening. The shot from the Forsaken Ridge had wounded his body, but the evidence they carried would wound the conspiracy far more deeply if they could find a way to expose it to the world. The hunt that had begun 3 days earlier had evolved into something far more complex than a simple pursuit operation. Marcus and his team were no longer just trying to survive. They had become the last hope for justice for hundreds of innocent victims whose deaths would otherwise remain hidden forever. The battle for their lives had become a battle for the truth, and the stakes could not have been higher. The abandoned monastery perched on the cliff face like a stone prayer frozen in time, its ancient walls bearing witness to centuries of conflict and survival in these remote mountains. Marcus Chun studied the building through his binoculars, noting the strategic advantages it would offer as a hiding place and the defensive positions that could be established among its crumbling ramparts. More importantly, the monastery contained something that could change everything, a short-wave radio transmission station that had been used by resistance fighters during the war and might still be functional. Sarah Williams crouched beside him behind a screen of pine branches, her auburn hair now streaked with dirt and her uniform torn from their desperate flight through the mountain forest. The past 18 hours had aged her beyond her years, but her green eyes still held the determination that had carried her through the impossible mission they had undertaken. In her pack, carefully wrapped in waterproof material, were copies of the documents they had captured from the enemy command post, evidence that could expose the genocidal conspiracy if they could find a way to transmit it to the outside world. Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Morrison had established a security perimeter around their observation position, but both men showed signs of the stress and exhaustion that came from being hunted continuously by superior forces. Tommy's youthful energy had been replaced by the wariness of someone who had seen too much violence too quickly, while Jake's weathered features reflected the grim knowledge that their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour. The radio intercepts that Jake continued to monitor painted a picture of a massive manhunt that was consuming enormous resources and involving units from multiple organizations. Roadblocks had been established at every possible exit point from the mountain region. Aircraft were conducting systematic searches of the terrain, and ground forces were moving in coordinated sweeps that left very few places to hide. The enemy's determination to eliminate Marcus and his team confirmed that the evidence they carried posed an existential threat to the conspiracy. Marcus's wounded shoulder had stiffened during their movement through the cold mountain air, and the improvised bandages that Sarah had applied were showing fresh bloodstains despite her careful attention to the injury. He knew that infection was becoming a serious risk, but medical attention would have to wait until they found a way to expose the evidence they had gathered or died trying to protect it. The decision to approach the monastery was driven by desperation as much as tactical considerations. Their other options had been systematically eliminated by the coordinated pursuit operation, and Marcus realized that they needed to take risks if they were going to accomplish anything more than merely delaying their inevitable capture or death. The ancient building represented their best chance of finding communication equipment that could reach sympathetic authorities outside the conspiracy. Sarah's reconnaissance of the monastery revealed that the building was indeed abandoned, but showed recent signs of use by people who might be local resistance fighters or simply refugees from the violence that was consuming the region. The shortwave radio equipment was still in place, though it would require technical expertise to determine whether it was functional. More encouraging was the discovery of food supplies and medical equipment that suggested the building was being used as a safe house by people who were fighting against the same forces that were hunting Marcus's team. The approach to the monastery required crossing open ground that would leave them vulnerable to observation from multiple directions, but the alternative was to remain hidden in the forest while their enemies tightened the cordon around their position. Marcus made the decision to move during the brief period between sunset and full darkness, when visibility would be limited but not completely eliminated. The crossing was accomplished without incident, though Marcus found the physical exertion increasingly difficult as blood loss and fatigue took their toll on his strength. Jake and Tommy had to assist him during the final climb to the monastery entrance, and Sarah was forced to carry additional equipment to compensate for his reduced capabilities. Inside the monastery, they discovered that their assessment had been correct. The building was being used as a base of operations by a group of local resistance fighters who had been conducting their own campaign against the military forces that were terrorizing the civilian population. The leader of the group was a former Yugoslav army officer named Colonel Dmitry Petrovich, who had been gathering evidence of war crimes for transmission to international authorities. Petrovich's reaction to Marcus's team and the evidence they carried was one of amazement and vindication. He had suspected the existence of a systematic campaign of genocide, but had lacked the detailed documentation that Marcus had captured from the enemy command post. The combination of Petrovich's local knowledge and Marcus's military intelligence created a complete picture of the conspiracy that reached from the battlefield to the highest levels of international politics. The documents that Marcus had captured revealed that the genocidal campaign was being funded through diverted peacekeeping budgets, coordinated through legitimate military channels, and covered up by officials who were supposed to be monitoring compliance with international law. The scope of corruption was so extensive that it would require investigation by multiple agencies in several countries to bring all the responsible parties to justice. Petrovich's shortwave radio equipment was functional, but reaching authorities who could act on the evidence would require careful consideration of which individuals and organizations were trustworthy and which might be compromised by the conspiracy. The wrong choice could result in the evidence being suppressed and everyone involved in exposing it being eliminated to protect the secrets. The solution came from an unexpected source when Jake Morrison remembered a contact from his previous intelligence assignments who worked for an international war crimes tribunal. The contact, a prosecutor named Maria Santos, had built a reputation for integrity and had the authority to initiate investigations that could not be suppressed by local political pressure. More importantly, she had established secure communication channels for receiving evidence from witnesses who were in danger. The transmission to Santos required several hours of careful preparation to encode the evidence in a format that could be sent over shortwave radio while maintaining security against interception by the enemy forces. Petrovich's technical expertise was crucial for this process, and his knowledge of secure communication protocols ensured that the evidence would reach its intended recipient without being compromised. As they worked through the night to prepare the transmission, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 days earlier, they had been peacekeeping soldiers conducting what they believed was a routine surveillance mission. The shot from the Forsaken Ridge that had wounded him had also shattered their faith in the institutions they served and forced them to confront the reality that some of the people they trusted were capable of unspeakable crimes. The transformation from soldiers following orders to resistance fighters exposing corruption had been painful and dangerous, but Marcus realized that it was also necessary. The evidence they were transmitting would save countless lives by exposing the genocidal campaign before it could claim more victims. The price they had paid in blood and betrayal was worth paying if it prevented further atrocities. The transmission began just before dawn, using atmospheric conditions that would allow the signal to reach its destination with maximum clarity and minimum risk of interception. Marcus watched through the monastery windows as the first light of morning illuminated the valley below, wondering if this would be the last sunrise he would ever see. The enemy forces were closing in, and their position would soon be discovered despite the ancient walls that sheltered them. Jake's monitoring of enemy communications confirmed that their location had been triangulated through electronic surveillance, and that ground forces were already moving to surround the monastery. Helicopter gunships were being positioned to provide fire support, and heavy weapons were being brought forward to eliminate any resistance that the building's defenders might offer. The final irony was that Marcus and his team had succeeded in their mission just as they were about to be overwhelmed by the forces that had been hunting them. The evidence that would expose the conspiracy had been safely transmitted to authorities who could act on it, but the witnesses who had gathered that evidence would not live to see justice served. Colonel Petrovich had prepared for this possibility by establishing defensive positions throughout the monastery that would allow a small number of defenders to hold off a much larger attacking force for a significant period of time. The ancient building had been constructed to withstand siege warfare, and its thick walls and commanding position made it an ideal location for a last stand. As the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, Marcus distributed the remaining ammunition among his team and checked their weapons one final time. Sarah Williams took up a position at a window that provided excellent fields of fire over the approach routes to the monastery. Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Morrison established a crossfire pattern that would catch attacking forces in a deadly trap if they tried to assault the building directly. The first shots of the final battle were fired just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the same ridge where a sniper had wounded Marcus 3 days earlier. This time, however, the roles were reversed. Sarah's accurate rifle fire struck down the lead elements of the attacking force, while Tommy and Jake used automatic weapons to suppress the enemy's advance. Marcus coordinated the defense from a position that allowed him to observe the entire battlefield while remaining protected from the withering fire that the attackers directed at the monastery walls. His wounded shoulder limited his ability to handle a weapon effectively, but his tactical experience was crucial for making the most effective use of their limited resources. The battle raged for hours as wave after wave of attackers tried to break through the monastery's defenses, only to be repelled by the accurate fire and determined resistance of its defenders. Colonel Petrovich's preparations had turned the ancient building into a fortress that seemed almost impregnable, despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the attacking forces. But Marcus knew that their situation was ultimately hopeless. They were running low on ammunition, and the enemy was bringing up heavy weapons that could breach the monastery walls. More importantly, the evidence they had died to protect was already beyond the reach of the conspiracy that had betrayed them. Justice would be served, even if the witnesses did not survive to see it. The final assault came just as their ammunition was nearly exhausted. The ancient walls of the monastery shuddered under the impact of rockets and artillery shells, but the building's medieval construction absorbed the punishment and continued to provide protection for its defenders. When enemy soldiers finally broke through the breach that had been blasted in the south wall, they found themselves facing opponents who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was brutal and desperate, with no quarter asked or given by either side. Marcus used his sidearm until the ammunition was gone, then fought with whatever weapons he could find among the rubble of the destroyed monastery. Beside him, Sarah Williams continued firing her rifle until a sniper's bullet found its mark, and Tommy Rodriguez fought with the desperate courage of youth until overwhelming numbers brought him down. Jake Morrison was the last member of Marcus's team to fall, using the final grenades to collapse a section of wall that buried him along with several of the attackers. Colonel Petrovich died defending the radio room, ensuring that the equipment could not be captured and used to trace the transmission that had exposed the conspiracy. Marcus Chun survived the battle, though his wounds were severe enough that he did not expect to live much longer. As he lay among the rubble of the destroyed monastery, he could hear the approaching helicopters that would carry him to whatever fate awaited prisoners who knew too much about activities that were supposed to remain secret. But the shot from the Forsaken Ridge that had begun this ordeal had ultimately led to something that the conspirators had not anticipated. The evidence that Marcus and his team had died to protect reached Prosecutor Maria Santos within hours of the battle's end, and the investigation that followed exposed the genocidal campaign and brought many of the responsible parties to justice. The truth had a power that bullets could not stop and corruption could not suppress. The men and women who died at the monastery had given their lives to ensure that hundreds of innocent victims would not be forgotten and that the people responsible for their deaths would face judgment for their crimes. In the end, the shot that changed everything was not the bullet that wounded Marcus Chun on a remote mountain ridge, but the truth that emerged from the courage of ordinary soldiers who refused to remain silent in the face of unspeakable evil. Their sacrifice ensured that justice would eventually be served and that the victims of genocide would not have died in vain.